Let's see, is this thing, oh, it's working. So if you were with us last week, we had some technical difficulties with the microphone. We have a great team of people who work up in the booth up there, and they think that we have it fixed. Yeah, we didn't even have to spend any money. You know, right? Like, that's always good. If you are a guest with us today, my name is Brian. If I have not had the opportunity to meet you, I'm one of the lead pastors here today. It just happens to be my week to speak. Tracy Wright, our other leading pastors over here, he'll be speaking here in a couple of weeks. Next week, we have a special guest speaker, and he is really good. And so you will not want to miss that. He's going to be talking about getting out of the boat, the story when Peter walks on water. And so, well, Jesus walks on water. Peter kind of does for a second. But anyway, it's going to be really good. Really want to encourage you to be here for that. But I am Brian. If I've not had the opportunity to meet you, welcome. We're glad that you're here. Hopefully you've heard that 10 or 12 times already. And we just hope that maybe you'll see or hear or experience something, and you might want to come back and be with us again sometime soon. If you are a guest and you don't have our church app and you would like to follow along with the notes this morning, we're going to give you a chance to do that. There's going to be a QR code on the screen behind me. You take your smart device out, phone, tablet, whatever you have, take a picture of that QR code. That'll take you to a YouVersion event that will allow you to follow along with everything we're going to be talking about today. There is some stuff in there that might be helpful to you, so I encourage you to jump out and grab that. If you're a regular attender at Five Rivers and you use our app, you know by now the drill. Just open your app, homepage, current series. Hopefully, I say this every week because I don't do it anymore, I've released this responsibility to someone else, so hopefully it says Sermon Notes, February 25th. Can anybody verify for me that it says that? That is awesome. I have a pretty amazing daughter named Esther who actually has assumed that responsibility for me, and she is doing a great job with it, and so it's amazing. I always like it when I can offload tasks. How many of you like to offload tasks so that you don't have to, right? If I could offload all my tasks, man, that'd be amazing. Not really, because I'm a task-driven person. It would drive me crazy. But anyway, welcome to Five Rivers Church today. I'm going to start with something a little bit fun. Last week we did some symbols. We're not going to do that this week. This week we're going to play a game of true or false. How many of you like true or false statements? Do I have any people who like true false statements? Y'all remember math class or whatever class? They would put, maybe it was history, and they would put a wrong date that was off by like 1 day, and they'd be like, this is a date that Pearl Harbor happened, and you'd miss it by 1 day, right? I'm not going to try and trick any of you today, okay? That's not what this is, okay? But we are going to play a little game of true or false, and so you're going to see a statement come up on the screen here momentarily, and when it comes up, you're just going to say whether this statement is true or false. You all get it? We all good? First statement is 4,000 is not equal to 5,000. True or false? Okay, so that statement is true. Now, let's do another statement. 4,000 is less than 5,000. Some of you are like, wow, I'm picking up on a theme. True, right? Okay, so the next statement we're going to put up is 4,000 is greater than 5,000. Oh, yeah, see, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you that that is a true statement, and you're all going to be like, Brian, how far did you go in math? Right? So what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to hang with me, and hopefully by the end of our time this morning, you will agree with me that 4,000 may just be greater than 5,000, okay? I know right now you're like, dude, you're crazy, you're whacked, right? Okay? Because you're like, in math class, I learned this. And when I was a junior in high school, that's a long time ago. When I was a junior in high school, I never will forget, our math teacher said, today, we're going to learn how to find the value of a negative, oh my gosh, it just left me, square root, right? How many of you remember in school where you learned that you can't find that because square root, you can't do that, right? And so I looked at my math teacher and I said, dude, you've been telling me my whole life that you can't do that. And now you're telling me that you can do that. And he says, yeah, and here's the best part. We're going to do it with imaginary numbers. And I thought, what? And Imagine, what kind of world am I living in, right? It's kind of like when you were little and your parents told you there was a tooth fairy, and then you found out it wasn't a tooth fairy. It was actually your parents putting the money under your pillow, right? And you were like, what? There are all these things in life, right, where we think something's true, and then we find out it's actually what? False. So what we're going to do today, hopefully, by the end of our time together, you're going to be able to look at me and say, okay, Brian, I think you may have stretched just a little bit, but maybe, just maybe, I can accept your statement that 4,000 is actually greater than 5,000. So let's jump in, shall we? What we want to do today is build from what we talked about last week. If you were not here with us last week, we talked about Jesus feeding of the 5,000 people. Some of you commented to me after that I kind of went pretty quickly through the numbers, okay, because we talked about a lot of numbers last week. And those of you who felt like the numbers were overwhelming last week are going to be thrilled to know that we're going to come back to some of those numbers again this week, but I promise you it'll be slower, okay? It'll be easier this week, okay? We're going to look at some numbers, and we're going to look at the feeding of the 4,000. So we're going to skip ahead just a little bit in the book of Matthew, and then Paul, our guest speaker, and Tracy, they're going to come back over the next 3 weeks, and they're going to fill that gap in, okay? So we're not going to skip everything. We're just doing these two talks back to back so that they're a little more impactful and they make a little more sense. One thing that's really important before I talk to you about the feeding of the 4,000 is context and location. If you were not able to be with us months ago, maybe even a year or more ago, we did a series called Setting the Stage, where we set the stage for our walk through the entire book of Matthew. Part of that series was called On Location, where we did a geographical study of the region in which Jesus did his ministry. And we told you way back then that it would be important to understand a little bit of the geography, because sometimes things that Jesus says and does are spoken to people in a certain geography or region, and it's important to understand that. Today, this week, is one of those weeks. Last week was one of those weeks, but I waited until this week to tell you that so it would make more sense to you. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at why geography matters to what we're going to talk about today. I'm only going to do a moment in this. It's not going to be very long. But what we need to understand is that previous to this reading, where we're going to be in Matthew chapter 15, there's some stuff that happens in Matthew 14 building up to what is happening here. Okay? What is the most important thing for you to understand is that Jesus leaves the religious triangle. Now, we're going to shoot a map up onto the screen, and you're going to see a red triangle at the top of the Sea of Galilee. For those of you who weren't able to be with us when we did our on-location study, that's called the religious triangle. The three cities or towns, Chorazin, Gennesaret, Capernaum, Bethsaida, those towns make like a triangle. And we call it the religious triangle because the Pharisees were very, very prominent in this particular region of the Israelites, the nation of Israel, okay? Very prominent in this particular region of Galilee. That is important. Jesus, in his feeding of the 5,000, was in that particular area when he performed that miracle. Jesus leaves that area. He heads northwest to a place called Tyre and Sidon, okay, the region of Tyre and Sidon, which is what we would say is a non-Jewish territory or a Gentile territory. That's important too, because Jews would not have gone there willingly. A good, God-fearing, God-honoring Jew would not have left their region to go up into Gentile country, because you just didn't do that. That's not what you do, okay? Jesus does, though. He goes northwest. You can't see it on this map because it's way up to the northwest, Tyre and Sidon. He does some things there, and then the Bible tells us that he makes his way back to the southeast. In the book of Mark, it actually tells us that he goes to the Decapolis. Now, if you are familiar with the Decapolis, it's a Gentile area, 10 cities that Alexander the Great built to prove how awesome Greece was and how awesome Hellenism was, okay? And so there's this Decapolis area that's very Gentile, and Jesus goes to this place. Now, some of you are like, who cares? I know, it's boring. Some of you are like, I just want to get to the meat. What are you trying to tell us today? This is really critical to understanding what Jesus is doing. He has left the religious area. He's gone into the irreligious pagan area. And he's going to do another miracle here. And it's going to be eerily similar to the miracle that he's just done in a very religious, very Jewish area. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look at how they're similar and, more importantly, how they're different and what Jesus might be saying in how he performs this miracle. This is critical too. Last week, if you missed it, Jesus, his disciples come to him after a day of like healing and madness and craziness, and they say, Jesus, there's all these people here. We need to get rid of them. Okay, you're tired, we're tired, they need food, there's no food here, you need to get rid of them. Tell them to go away so they can eat. Jesus says, no, you feed them. They're like, yeah, right, okay. There's like 5,000 of them. That's just men, okay? We got 5 fish, 2 loaves of bread, it ain't gonna happen. Jesus is like, you're right, it's not gonna happen, bring me what you have. He blesses it. If you were here last week, you'll remember all this. He blesses it, he multiplies it, he gives it to his disciples, they give it to the people, and there's not just enough to feed them, right? There's more than enough. In fact, so much more than enough. There's 12 basketfuls left over, okay? Now, I'm not going to go through all those numbers, okay, because there's a lot of them. They're in your notes. How many of you grabbed the sermon notes this morning? If you grabbed the sermon notes, you can take a look at them. There's a quick review of the numbers that we find in Jewish culture. I'm only going to look at a couple of them. The first one is the number 4. Number 4 is the number that represents the Gentiles, oftentimes, the 4 corners of the earth. This will be all the non-Jewish people. We're also going to look at the number 7. Okay, the number 7, which represents completeness or wholeness. You'll see there that the 7 days often represented a completeness, like the 7 days of creation. Okay, in the Jewish world, the number 7 is really important. The number 7 is all over the place. Okay, it's all over the place. And so this would have meant something to the Jewish people. It would have been an important number to them. And so we find in that first story, 5 loaves and 2 fish equals what? What was it? This is not a trick, I promise. Some of you are like, is this a trick again? No. 7, right? 5 and 2 is 7. Completeness, law, all the things God gave the people. And then he blessed it. He gave it back to him. He said, this is enough because I am enough. Okay? Are y'all with me so far? So far, you're with me. Okay, good. So what happens now is Jesus goes into Gentile territory. He has a really busy day. They're in a very remote area. And we find the disciples coming back to him and finding another feeding problem. Okay? And so we're going to read. Are all those numbers up there again? Stephen, did I put them all up there? Oh, yeah. We're going to skip past those, okay? That's totally my fault. It's totally my fault. I don't have time to do them today. So what we're going to do is we're going to read Matthew chapter 15, verses 29 through 39. And we're going to see how this story looks a lot like the previous story that we just read. It begins in verse 29 where it says, Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Now, if you go and you read in the book of Mark, he's a little bit more descriptive, and he says that he's actually in the region of the Decapolis. So if you're looking at your little map on your phone, you'll see that the Sea of Galilee has an east bank and a west bank, okay? So we would be looking at the bank on the east, the area where it says Hippos over there. Jesus is on this side of the lake or the sea. So he went up on a mountainside and he sat down. And then it tells us that great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. Continuing to read, the people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And what did they do? They praised the God of Israel. And where are we right now, folks? We're in the Decapolis, right? We're in Gentile territory. Let's continue along. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on these people. They have already been with me 3 days, and they have nothing to eat. I do not want them to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. Now, let's just stop and pause for just a moment. And let's imagine that we're with Jesus. Okay, we've watched him do all these miracles and all this stuff. And he makes a statement like this. Guys, I don't want them to collapse on their way home. Now, some of you might not appreciate, like, I think Jesus had a little bit of sarcasm to him at times, right? Like, I think Jesus was a human just like me. And I think he's like, guys, we don't want them to collapse on their way. How many of you think that's just a little drama on Jesus' part? I mean, really? Come on. Like, they're going to collapse on their way home. I don't know. I thought it was interesting. I think it's funny. And here's what his disciples have to say in response. They say this. Where would we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? Now, how many of you think that sounds familiar to the last story that we just read? Now keep in mind, they've already watched him do this once, but where were they? They were in Jewish territory last time, right? The people God cares about and loves about. Now where are they? They're in Gentile territory where God doesn't care about the pagans. The pagans are evil. God does not have any use for the pagans. Okay? Some of you are like, wow, Brian, that's such a bold statement. I'm just telling you that the Jewish people would have seen it that way. These are dogs. We don't care about these people. Why are we even here? Okay? But this is what they say. Let's move on. So the next verse says, how many loaves do you have? Jesus asked them. And what do they answer? How many loaves do they have? They have 7 loaves. And then they say a few small fish. Okay? He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. How many of you feel like, man, this sounds so familiar to the last story that we read? Right? Now, how many of you remember in the last story, Jesus was, or I should say Matthew was really clear about how many fish and loaves they had. Did you all pick up on that? How many loaves was it? 5? And then how many fish? 2. 2 fish and 5 loaves. Very specific numbers, yes? Now, how does Matthew record this telling? He says there's 7 loaves and how many fish? A few, because God couldn't remember how many fish there were. God, right? Of course not. Does it matter how many fish there were? You see, here's the weird thing. Why all of a sudden is Matthew like, yeah, it was just a few fish. Who cares about the fish? Where in the last story, the fish mattered, man. The number of fish were important, but here the number of fish just isn't important for some reason. So he says, okay, guys, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a story. We're going to do something cool. So everybody sit down on the ground. And the next verse says this. He took the 7 loaves and the fish. When he had given thanks, he broke them, gave them to his disciples, and they in turn to the people. Exactly what happened in the last story. This is exactly the same thing, folks. Then it says they all ate and they were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Was there leftover in our last story? Yep. Who went and picked up the leftovers? The disciples. The number of those who ate was 4,000 men, besides women and children. So we have these 2 stories. Some people who've studied Scripture actually think that this is the same telling, or it's a second telling of the same story, that Matthew just changes the numbers in, okay? I remember growing up and hearing about the feeding of the 5,000, but I never really heard much about the feeding of the 4,000. Can any of you relate to my experience? Right? Because there's not a little boy who comes and sacrifices all he has in this story. And we really like that part of the other story, right? I mean, we all like that part. So the 4,000 story just kind of gets brushed aside. Yeah, Jesus does it again, but who really cares, okay? But I want us to care. I want us to pay attention to the feeding of the 4,000 because there's a number that rises to the surface when we look at this particular story, okay? And that number is 7. Now, some of you are like, yeah, I remember the number 7. You just talked about it, creation, right? You talked about creation, the wholeness of creation. 7 represents completeness and wholeness. But while 7 represents creation, and 7 represents a lot of things that we might be like, those are good things, 7 also represented the number of pagan nations that Israel encountered when they entered the Promised Land. How many of you remember the story of Israel coming into the Promised Land? If you know the story, God promised them an area, and when they would go into it, they would have it'd be awesome, because he promised them this land, it was going to be great. But there were some not so great people living in it at the time. Okay? So there are 2 places in Scripture where God references these 7 pagan nations. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1, it says this, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, he actually names them. And if you count them, you will find that there are 7. They are the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Make sure you remember that because there'll be a quiz later, okay? And then God says, what about those 7 nations, folks? They are larger and stronger than you. For the Jewish people, this number 7 represents completeness or wholeness, and it's quite possible, and I would say even likely, that this represents not just these 7 nations, but all of the pagan nations of the world. Are you all with me? Yeah? There's this number 7 represents completeness and wholeness. In Joshua chapter 3, verse 10, God ratchets it up a little bit. He says, this is how you'll know that God is among you. He will drive out before you those same 7 nations, the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. This number 7, when we're looking at it in a non-Jewish context, can take on an entire different flavor, an entire different meaning than when we're in Jewish territory. How many loaves did the disciples have, folks? 7. Was that 7 made up of 5 and 2 like it was in the previous story? No, it wasn't. Some of you are like, Ryan, can you prove that? Of course I can't absolutely prove it. But numbers matter, yes? We talked about this last week. Numbers matter. We find 7 loaves, and how many baskets were left over at the end of our story, folks? How many was it? 7. Now, in the first story, how many were left over? 12. How many disciples were there? 12. How many tribes of Israel are there? 12. How fitting would that be? That in a Jewish area, you have 12 baskets left over. But when you come into Gentile territory, the story changes it. And this time, there's how many left over? How many pagan nations were there? 7. How many loaves were they to have to begin with? 7. And what does the number 7 represent? Completeness, wholeness, all that you have, everything. And how many people were fed in this story? 4,000. The number 4 represents what, according to our numerical look earlier? The Gentiles, right? The reference to the 4 corners of the earth, all the people who are not Jewish. So let's imagine for a moment that what these numbers could be saying is that Jesus takes these 7 loaves, the completeness of everything the disciples have to bring him. Are you all with me so far? The 7 loaves represent, this is all we have. This is the completeness of what we have to give you. The 7 baskets representing the completeness, the wholeness of all the people in the world who are not Jewish. The nations of pagan land, the Gentile people. And that's reinforced to us when we read the number 4,000, as the number of the Gentile people to the 4 corners of the earth. You see, I think this is so incredibly important. Last week, Jesus is speaking to a Jewish audience, and he's using Jewish numbers, and he's likely, I can't say with 100% certainty, but he's likely communicating, I am enough for all of the Jewish people. All of them. Not just the privileged, not just the smart enough, not just the good enough, but all of them. And this week, in this particular reading of this feeding of people, all the numbers change. And yet the concept and the message seems to be the same. What you're bringing me is not enough. Are you all with me so far? Is 7 loaves enough to feed 4,000 people? They would have to be some pretty big loaves, right? You have to bring those suckers up on a semi, and I don't think they had those back then. Okay? The loaves aren't enough. So they're bringing the completeness of what they have. It's not enough. Jesus takes those loaves and does what with them, folks? Do you remember when we just read it? He gives thanks for them, and he blesses them. And then what does he do with them? He breaks them and distributes them to whom? His disciples. And what did the disciples do with them? They distribute them to the people. And then what happens? They still don't have enough? They do have enough, don't they? They have more than enough. And how much more than enough do they have? 7 baskets. Just so fittingly enough for every one of those pagan nations that are listed in our list of 7 pagan nations. So you see, here's the moral of the story. The moral of the story is, without Jesus, the loaves are not enough, right? So whatever we bring to Jesus, without him is not enough. You all with me? But Jesus somehow miraculously makes what we bring to him enough. Enough. And not just enough, but what? More than enough. Last week I shared with you that I thought there was a profound truth hiding in the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Right? That no matter what we bring to Jesus, it's not enough. Right? For the Jewish people, they had their 5 books of Moses and their 2 tablets, and man, they were pretty staunchly observant of those things, right? They were very staunchly observant. They tried as best they could to make those things enough. And it's like Jesus saying, guys, look, even with this, and the 7 represented by the 5 books and the 2 tablets came from whom? Who gave the books to Moses and the tablets to Moses? Who? God did. So this is the hardest part probably of the story for some of us to wrap our heads around. I know it was for the Jews. You're telling me that something God gave me is not enough. Yeah. That seems to be what God is saying. Yes, I gave you this, but in part to show you that you can't do this for yourself. In part, the law, the purpose of the law is to help you understand that you're never going to be good enough to do this on your own. You're going to need what? Me. You're going to need me to do this. And I think the moral of the story for the Jewish people is, yeah, you can try as hard as you can to follow these 5 books and these 2 tablets, but without me, without God himself, without me, the Son of God, the Messiah, it will never be enough. Now, I think that the disciples probably got this, and they were like, you go, Jesus, man, we believe in you. We're on your side. Until you go into Gentile territory, what are you doing? Why are we here? Because now the stakes are raised exponentially higher. Because the Jews would never have believed, they would never have understood that God wasn't just there to save them. He was there to save the Gentiles as well. In other words, the kingdom of God isn't just open to Jewish people. The kingdom of God is open to all people. And I'm going to tell you right now, folks, there are things we find to argue about, don't we? Are there theological things you get in arguments with people about? Oh, no, because we all agree. I forgot. Silly me. We all agree on everything. I have to remember. But we argue about things all the time. If you think some of our arguments can be tough, I can only imagine that the religious leaders at Jesus' time, when they heard him making statements like this, they were like, dude, when they used the word blasphemy, folks, that's a strong word. It wasn't thrown around lightly in their day. They accused him of blasphemy for making statements like these. And I believe wholeheartedly that when Jesus does this feeding of these 4,000 people, he's not expecting the people that he's feeding to understand these numbers. Are you all with me? You see, I don't believe for one moment that the people sitting out there eating their bread were like, wow, the number 7. Jesus is symbolizing that we're the pagan nations and he loves and cares for us. They wouldn't probably have known any of that because they didn't have the law or any of the stuff that the Jewish people had. These numbers weren't for them. You all follow me? Who would these numbers have been for? Who is Jesus saying this to? Who is he trying to help understand the magnitude of the statement? The disciples, the people who are following him. You see, I think that's so critical. Because we look at it and we think, yeah, Jesus is like trying to tell these pagans, these Gentiles, right? He's helping them understand the importance of the biblical numbers. No, I don't think so. I don't think Jesus is trying to say, hey guys, strap in, pay attention, because these numbers are going to matter something to you when you start following me. These numbers are going to become super important to you when you start following me. You see, I don't think that at all. I think Jesus is trying to tell his disciples, guys, I'm not just enough for the Jews. I'm not just enough for you. I'm enough for all of them. For all these people that you look at and you think they're not good enough, they're not worthy enough, they're not valuable enough, they are. Everyone. My kingdom is open to everyone. Now, I want to share something else as I wrap up. What time is it right now? I can't even see. My watch doesn't work. Okay, good. 11:47. Woohoo! The crowd, listen, the crowd who met Jesus in the Decapolis, right? That crowd of 4,000 people, where do you think they came from? Have any of you ever thought where those people came from? They don't know Jesus as Messiah like the Jews do. Where did these people come from? What made them come and see Jesus? You see, Jesus makes 2 trips recorded in Scripture to the Decapolis. The first one that he makes, he meets a dude named Legion, or a guy who's demon-possessed. Okay? Matthew and Mark's tellings are a little bit different, so some of you can argue with me. I'm not going to do it. Send me an email. Maybe we'll talk. I don't know. Okay? But Jesus meets someone or someones who are demon-possessed. They're possessed of a demon. Jesus frees them from this demonic possession in this Gentile area. And the Gentiles are so excited that they ask Jesus to come and spend time with them. No. Jesus casts these demons into a herd of pigs, and they throw themselves off of a mountainside, and the people are furious, and they're like, get out because you're creating problems here. They did not want Jesus there. Y'all with me so far? This one dude who we read about in Mark chapter, I can't remember if it's 5 or 7, I don't remember where it is. Earlier in Mark, this one guy, Jesus tells him he can't go and follow him. Instead, go back to the Decapolis and tell everyone what you have had happen to you. Go and tell everyone about your encounter with Jesus. Jesus comes back to that area not long after, and how many people are waiting for him? 4,000 people. Now, here's my question to you. What did this one guy, this dude who hung around the caves possessed of a demon, had to offer people about Jesus? What did he have to tell them, folks? Did he have the law and the tablets? Did he have that, folks? What did he have? He had his story about who? Jesus. All he had was, this is what happened when I met Jesus. And you know what it proved to be, folks? Enough. You see, here's one of the challenges, I think, for us in the modern expression of the evangelical church in America. We like to say things like Jesus is enough, but we don't believe it a lot of times. We don't believe that Jesus is enough. And I think we need to really step back and rethink, do we believe that Jesus is enough? Because this guy goes back and he tells all these people, hey, I don't know anything about this guy other than this. I was possessed of a demon until I met him. And when he left me, I was free. I believe in who this guy is. I don't know anything about him, but I believe in him enough to tell you that he can do the same thing for you. And 4,000 people show up and are ready to hear about this Jesus. The guy had nothing other than the testimony of his own personal story. And I think that when we read this story, and when the disciples looked out and saw all those people, and they saw Jesus do this miracle in the same way he did the other, they finally started to get it. There is so much more to this man than we could possibly have imagined. And I think the moral of the story today is this: Jesus is enough. No matter who you are sitting here today, if you have been a church-going, good, God-fearing Christian your whole life, you need to understand that apart from Jesus, that means nothing. Paul himself talked about his accomplishments as filthy rags. So you can be a church-going person your whole life, but you need to understand that Jesus has to be what's enough. All of that doesn't matter. It has to be that Jesus is enough. If you're someone who's here and you're like, look, man, I don't know anything about all this religious stuff you talk about, all these verses and stories, I don't know any of those stories, and you're intimidated when you come into the fellowship of believers, when you come into this room where all these Christians hang out and you feel like, man, I will never be like them. I'll never be enough. You don't have to be enough. Why? Because Jesus is enough. Jesus is what will make you whole and complete. But you have to allow him to do that. We so often get in the way of that. We so often make it like, well, you have to do this, and this. And you have to understand the Bible the way we understand it, and you have to look this way, and you have to look that way. We think we like to say Jesus is enough, but do we believe it? Do we believe Jesus is enough? Jesus takes 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he makes them enough, does he not? Jesus takes 7 loaves and a few fish, and he makes them enough, right? Not just enough, but what? More than enough. Folks, here's my challenge to you today. Do you believe that Jesus is enough? Do you believe that you can live your life in such a way to let your life tell the story that Jesus alone is enough? Now, some of you are probably like me. If I'd heard this message 10 years ago, I'd have been like, dude, you are in dangerous territory. Because you're saying that the Bible doesn't matter. Am I saying that? Not even a little bit. Jesus didn't come out and say, throw those 5 loaves and 2 fish in the trash because we don't need them. Right? He didn't say that. What he did say was, that isn't what makes it. Folks, I am what make it. So let's think about this. I'm going to have, where's John? There's John. John's going to go up here in just a second. He's going to lead us in a time of communion. Okay? And what I want you to do when he comes up here is I want you to spend a few moments thinking about, okay, do you believe? I want you to pick, for the Jews, all the pagans would have been like the worst people they could imagine. And I hate to even use that terminology. But I want you to think of somebody in your mind who's like the person who you think like is the person who makes America a bad place. Because all of you have that. If these people would just get their act together, this will be a good country again. Okay, you visualize those people and you ask yourself, what is enough for them? What is enough for them? What do they need to see to be a part of kingdom? Do they need to see how I follow all the rules? Do they need to see how I understand this? Do they need to see how I believe this? What do they need to see, folks? They need to see how Jesus was enough for me. People need to see how Jesus is enough for you. And maybe, just maybe, they will believe